I'm back with you today to talk about another legendary NBA shooting guard, Kobe Bryant. There's been a lot of that with Kobe, in his retirement tour about how he's, the best player of his generation. And he's got the five rings and he was the heir to Michael Jordan. And he's the best of this era. And, you know, um, I disagree with that. I think Kobe Bryant is one of the probably 15 best players that have ever lived. He's I've heard the expression, he's on the inner circle of the inner circle of the Hall of Fame, so he's one of the best. I respect his game, but he was not the best, neither of all time or even of his own generation. Um, and so today we're going to talk about that. We're going to look into the reasons why I would say something like that. So um, there's a few things. So Kobe's career, he's the type that my partner Rod used to have this thing he called the 10-step test. He used it for approaching women, but it works here as well. And the 10-step test was you see somebody from a distance, then you take 10 steps closer, and then you look again. Then you take 10 steps closer and look again. And if it's real, in Rod's case, if the girl was really, as beautiful as he thought she was from a distance, the closer she got, the better she should look. But if the closer you got, the more you have questions, then that kind of raises the flag. So in Kobe's case, you look from a distance and you see, he's got five rings. Only Tim Duncan in this generation can match him with that. He got like a record or near the record number of All-Star nods of NBA first teams, of NBA All Defense teams. He's just was on them every year for like a decade or two, and that's a hugely impressive thing. Especially once you put it with the rings, it's like, yeah, this guy was the real deal. However, when you start talking about a player being the best of his generation, then I think there are closer ways, better ways to really examine that than just a ring count or an accolades count. What did he do on the court, and how much did that translate into success for his team? So when I'm looking at Kobe Bryant versus the other players of his generation, I think there's kind of three main test areas where you could really try to hone in on what's the best. One way to do it is to look at MVP finishes. I would take it beyond just who won the MVP because sometimes the best player doesn't necessarily win the MVP all the time. There's circumstances. The MVP is a very team-related accolade, and so maybe the best player is on a bad team, or maybe there was some disagreement. Maybe he happened to come along at the time of another really really great player. So instead of just looking at the top who won the most MVPs, let's look at the top two. In a given year, who were the top two vote getters for the NBA MVP. If you come to the next generation after Kobe's with LeBron, you see the same thing. He's by far leading in these top two MVP finishes. But then when you actually look at those players from the 90s that would be Kobe's peers, every every MVP won between the year 2000 and the year 2008 were won by players drafted in the 90s. Before that was players from the 80s. After that was players from 2000s. But from 2000 to 2008, every MVP was won by a player that was drafted in the 90s. And so if you look at those players from the 90s and look at the top two MVP finishes, you see Tim Duncan is in first. He's got the most top two MVP finishes with four. Shaq, the next step down is Shaq and Kevin Garnett, and interestingly, Steve Nash. They all have three. And then once you get down to the fifth slot on the list, that's where you run into Kobe with two. That to me, that rings a little bit of an alarm. It's not a definite thing. I know that I would agree that Kobe is a better player than Steve Nash, and Nash finished better than him in that particular test. My point is there's a strong correlation between the players that we consider to be the best of all time or the best of their generation and success in these box score metrics. If we use Magic as the bottom line, at least double digits over a career seems to be about the floor of what I was seeing as I looked over history. Then you come to the 90s, and you got Shaq, who led the league in one of those categories 18 times. You've got Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett, who led the league in one of those categories 12 times each. You've got Dirk Nowitzki, who led the league in one of those categories, regular or postseason, 5 times. So we're out of the double figures. We're more down in that Karl Malone, Barkley kind of range. And then you've got Kobe Bryant, who across the regular season and the playoffs for his long 20-year career has led the league in one of those categories exactly once. Once. Not 5 times, not 10, not 50 like LeBron or Jordan. Once. So again, as a standalone, that doesn't, it's not point proven that Kobe couldn't have been the best. But, now we're starting to see a pattern. When you looked at the MVP votes, Kobe finished 5th in this generation. When you start looking at the box score stats, again, Kobe's way down, but behind those same players that he was finishing behind in the MVP votes. So now let's go to the area where you might think Kobe would shine. Kobe's won 5 rings. Only Tim Duncan can match that among the star players of this generation. So let's start looking at team success. But with this being the data ball era, the analytics era, we don't have to just look at rings. Let's do something else. Let's look at an analytics approach that lets you estimate how much impact a player is having on his team's scoring margin. Now, what's called regularized adjusted plus minus, or RAPM, is about the best that we have for a pure impact stat measure. And I say pure in that it doesn't involve the box score at all. So that's another nice thing about looking at this separate from the box scores. Like, we've looked at what the box score stats said. Now let's look at what the team stats say. How has the team scoring margin been affected by the presence of one player on the court versus the presence of another player on the court? So if Kobe was the driving factor behind his team winning all of these championships and having so much success, then you would expect him to show up really well in this type of approach. And he does. He shows up really well. He's among the league leaders, many times over his career. One of my colleagues has come up with a way to be able to compare RAPM scores from one season to the next using a normalization method. And so using that method, if you add up, okay, who had the highest 5 individual year scores, Kobe's going to end up in the top 10. You say, okay, who had the highest 3-year scores, Kobe's going to be in the top 10. You say who had the highest career score, again, Kobe's going to be up near the top. However, he's not at the top. Again, just like in those other approaches, he falls behind his peers. You start saying, okay, well, who's led the NBA in RAPM? And we have this stat back to the 1998 season is the earliest season that I've seen. Actually, no, I think 1997 possibly. But if you look back to 97, 98, who's led the league? You get Shaq multiple times, 3 times. You get LeBron recently several times. You get Kevin Garnett several times. You get Tim Duncan. You get Dirk Nowitzki. All of them have led the league in this impact-based stat at least once in their career. You get to Kobe, 0, stingy with dinero. Never led the league in it. Never second in the league in it. Never third in the league. He'll be top 5, top 10. But he never measures out as the best. And if you take the approach that I mentioned a second ago of adding it up over 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Again, Kobe's going to be top 10, but your number ones are going. I mean, your top ones are going to be your LeBrons, your Duncans, your Garnetts, your Shaqs. Even Nowitzki tends to finish higher than Kobe in these measures. So, you run into the situation where we've looked at the game a lot of different ways. And I guess to be fair, with the box scores, we looked at both the regular and the postseason. There's no such thing as RAPM for just the postseason. The postseason is factored into it. But if you wanted to look at some plus minus scores for just the postseason, that is available. Again, on Basketball Reference, they have what they call on court, off court plus minus that they track for the playoffs. It's a really noisy stat, especially for just a handful of games. So I don't pay attention to it a lot for people that only make the first round or the second round in a given year. But once you start getting out to the conference finals or the championship, there are at least some interesting things that I've seen. And again, if you look at just the playoffs, just where you might think Kobe was shining, on his way to these championships, again, he shows up really well, over a career, but he doesn't show up as the best. You start looking at who has the best marks, especially during championships. Again, you're running into your Shaqs, your Duncans, your LeBrons, your Garnetts, your Dirk Nowitzki in 2011, not your Kobe's. I think he led his team in playoff on court, off court plus minus once in the year they made it at least to the conference finals. But the rest of that crew is all multiple times. So again, it's a story that's being told and retold no matter how you look at it. If you look at what the accolades say the best are, Kobe's fifth of this generation. If you look at what the box scores say the best of this generation are, Kobe's well behind his peers. If you look at what the non-box scores, just the team-based impact stats, what they say, again, the same group of players are all ahead of Kobe. And I can see the argument, well, LeBron's the next generation. I can even see the argument that maybe Shaq might be the previous generation. Even if you move them to the next levels, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, they clearly just keep measuring out as better than Kobe. Dirk is in the argument, but either way, I feel comfortable and confident in saying that if you really examine, really look at the different ways that you can analyze the game, Mr. Kobe Bean Bryant is one of the greatest. He's one of the best of this generation and of all time, but he's not the best. He's not the best of all time, and he's not even the best of his generation.